right. Welcome to our third conversation, which today we are talking about youth identity, youth perspectives, and youth preferences. And thank you for joining us wherever you are, and thank you for creating time to be with us in the next 1.5 hours. This conversation has been organized by SAYDS, which stands for Systems Acumen for Youth-Led Development Solutions. We are a non-profit organization that's committed to tackling youth marginalization, exclusion, disengagement in social initiatives. We, in the past 2 years, have been working with youth in Kenya on various issues in social change. And one of the things we've been trying to do is just learn what it means to be youth and what it means to do social change and what youth perspectives are. So these youth have been working on 9 different problems, which has provided us an opportunity to really understand what their perspectives are and what they believe those situations should look like in the future. So we sort of created this platform to try and achieve 3 goals, in the sense that we also still learning what youth means. And so we needed to be able to engage with youth and engage with those that work with youth. So this platform is to have conversations that share what we learned and what we are still learning from other people. This platform also allows us to engage with those that are working with youth in different contexts, and also inspire others to try to use complexity perspective and systems thinking to tackle complex problems in the 21st century. So today we want to talk about 4 different things. What perspectives do we use to understand the reality of youth in Africa? And how does that inform our understanding of the African youth identity? The second question we will engage is what are the variety of factors that influence Africa's youth identity, including global factors? And this can be looked at from different perspectives. And then how do beliefs and values that are associated with youth identity shape their preferences for social change? And lastly, why should organizations that work with Africa's youth on social change matters take this issue seriously? The goal is really not to try to provide perfect answers to these questions. After all, the issue of identity is complex and ever evolving. However, we hope that the conversation will inspire you to think about how youth in Africa form their identities or create them or construct them, how they see the world from the identities that they have formed and the beliefs about social change that are associated with those identities, and also challenge you to try and see them in ways that they desire to be seen and heard, and consider the extent to which social change initiatives are aligned with the vision that youth have for the future and their preferences. After all, today's significant large population of youth in Africa is also Africa's future community. So now let's just begin by briefly allowing our guests to briefly introduce themselves, and our panelists basically to introduce themselves just briefly before we get started. And we'll start with you, Perpetua.
Well, my name is Perpetua Muthoni, and I am the current Vice President and Head of Strategy at SAYDS. Yes.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Hi, so I'm Rebecca Mqamelo, currently in South Africa, and I am studying data science and economics while also working at a decentralized finance startup.
All right, thank you. Jane?
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
My name is Jane Nanga. I work as a community liaison officer within a research organization in Kenya at the University of Nairobi. And our main aim is to solve the which is not related to this for the that is an activity.
Jen, I think there was a little audio issue there, but maybe we'll come back to you in a moment. And we also have Maurice. Go ahead, Maurice. Yes, we are doing introductions.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Maurice Simwa. I am a medical doctor in Nairobi, and also I run a company called Khweva, where we deal with performing arts and digital, and also all form of arts, live and digital, performing arts and digital arts.
Right, thank you, Maurice. And soon we are also going to have Nandre with us. She's just joining shortly, with the problems. Zoom must be having a lot of problems earlier this morning. but she's here. She's just working her way into the panel, and we will introduce you to her shortly in a moment. So thank you so much, Maurice, Jen, Rebecca, and Perpetua for being with us. And one of the ways, one of the questions that perhaps is important to start with is why focusing on this category of African youth identity matters, and in what context exactly? Because I think that's going to be very key to think about what essentially it matters, what it means when we say African youth identity, and why should we be talking about that. I personally started to seriously grapple with this question of what an African identity means when I started my undergraduate studies in the US several years ago when I was in Africa. When I arrived in the US about 2004, I kind of took it for granted when I was in Africa. And I think most of us were in Africa who, you're more like a fish that's born in this ocean, and you don't think about this identity issue so much because you're socialized in it and you don't grapple with it. But when you leave, I'm sure like Rebecca and Perpetua, this is something that you begin to think about because now you're exposed to a different set of worldviews, different social circumstances and different issues, and this becomes something that you begin to grapple with. So when I was undergraduate, I started this organization called African Students Studies Association, or Students Association. The key thing for this association, the main goal was to develop a stronger sense of our African identities and take pride in them, in some sense develop Black consciousness. So from the time when I was an undergraduate, up to now, when I completed my studies and even started teaching, I've been trying to think about what this identity means in terms of action, in terms of what it means in terms of how I look at the world and how I look at Africa, and what it means in terms of promoting values that are African. So in my education, I've taught various classes on African development, poverty and development in Africa, or African experiences. And what I have seen is that when you have a population of students who are from different parts of the world, this question becomes even more relevant, especially when you have students who are starting to become involved in development, because some of them become interested in development in Africa, but then they are interested in development in Africa from different perspectives. And so they may have a different perspective and different preferences on what development should look like. But an African student may have a different perspective and different preferences. So it becomes essential then to think about if this is the future population that's learning about development in Africa, but from a different perspective, whether it's Western or Eastern part of the world or Asian, and they're interested in development, it would sort of vary from student to student. So it's important to think about this question. So I wonder, Rebecca, maybe starting with you, why do you think focusing on this issue of African youth identity matters?
Yeah, I think to begin answering that, it's worth noting that I very much come here also seeking those same answers, because as someone who is young, who grew up in South Africa, who has spent the majority of her college years outside of the African continent, this is also something I found myself asking. What is African identity? To be quite honest, it was never a question that was ever posed to me growing up, and going through the entire public school system in South Africa, let alone even the question of South African identity. I think that the question itself is something that we just don't really ask often enough. And this, now to answer your question specifically, I had the experience of traveling to another African country for the first time in the last 2 years or so. And that experience is incredibly eye-opening for me, because it made me realize, number one, Africa is huge, geographically and culturally, and in terms of the political spectrum that is there. But number two, unless you physically go out, it seems that there aren't that many opportunities to actually understand what African identity is, because it's one thing to say what it is, it's a very another thing to actually experience it, since we're talking about a collective identity. So, there are many, I think, consequences or implications of being able to define that, but I would just say that really the most important and the most pressing, I think, for my generation is that question of self and the role of the self within the collective community that we live in.
Interesting. So I wonder, just coming back to you, Maurice, Rebecca makes a very interesting point in the sense that when you go out, you get to acquire different understandings, of course, when you compare it with other perspectives, and it exposes you to this question. Maurice, what are your experiences with this concept of African identity? What does it mean for you as youth today?
Well, the thing about not even like the African generation, like my generation right now, we seem to be completely lost because of two things. Number one, we live in a society now where we're expected to be global citizens, where we're expected to be, one whole world, a global culture, etc. But then as Africans, we have nothing to bring on the table. And the reason why that is so is because, unfortunately, having gone through, the previous century and all the history that happened there, a lot of our culture was wiped out. So for us, we actually don't know too much about ourselves, and we're not even, I know this is one of those controversial things, but we're not too proud of some of the things which used to be African, like the association of evil and bad things with Black people and African people became such a contemporary and a global issue to the point where it completely whitewashed our history. And the problem now we have is, without that, we lack an identity to bring on the table as global citizens. So we are at a place where we are more or less fighting to find ourselves, to find our history, to know who we are. But at the same time, we're in a very fast moving society where we are easily influenced by Western culture and all these other forms of culture. But I honestly believe, without knowing who you are or what you are, there isn't much that you can do. And you'll always feel lost, even as an African in another country or even within Africa itself.
Yes, sir.
So that whole,
So there's something, and Nandre, welcome. So Nandre has joined us. And Nandre, I think in some sense you've joined also at a right point, interestingly, because we are talking about this issue of history, right? Nandre has done work on historical consciousness of youth. And so I want to actually bring her in here. So if I was to capture what Maurice is saying, and we can all relate to, is that the challenge that Maurice is pointing out that we struggle with as youth is that we live in a global, we have been exposed, I guess we could frame it as we're exposed to globalization. For Rebecca and Perpetua, you travel to these places, so you're not even exposed. You actually visit these places that have different perspectives and different histories. And what Maurice is saying is that why we are lost, why youth are lost, is because you're also expected to be a global citizen, and you're also expected to be African as well. So it makes it a little bit difficult to understand what it means to be African in the context of globalization, in the context of other factors that come in, and history plays a part here. So Nandre, what do you think the challenge then, how would you articulate this challenge from your own understanding and from your own work, working with youth on issues of historical consciousness, this idea of being lost because of exposure to other global factors?
Thank you, Levy. Well, I kind of have a different view. I actually don't agree with the dichotomy of young Africans being seen as lost, or us seeing ourselves as lost. And oftentimes African youth are portrayed in this way, especially by the older generations, that the young people are lost, they don't know their history, they don't know their traditions, they don't know their past, while at the same time, those same elders were the ones that did not pass on those traditions and that history. So I think it's very complicated and it's very complex. And I think that oversimplifications of our African youth identity are not necessarily very helpful. I find that young Nigerians, and again, I can't speak to the entire African context, but having experience both in Nigeria and in the US and in the African diaspora, and also meeting and relating to Africans from around the world, I think the African youth do have some idea of their history. It may not be actually the history that we want to, maybe that we prescribe or that we say, but all people have a sense of historical consciousness and all people have a sense of identity. Whether it is constructed in the ways which are acceptable, whether we know specific things about our past is definitely a question mark. So for instance, in Nigeria, for over 30 years, history was removed from the main curriculum from primary 1 to primary 9. and history was not taught in schools. So actually everyone from my generation, and this was done in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, so basically everyone 40 and under has never taken a history class, except they were an art student and they chose that topic as an elective. So yes, there is definitely a deficiency in terms of historical knowledge about both Nigeria's history and definitely about African history and African identity, very little knowledge. But we also have to understand that this is not necessarily a mistake, and it's not actually something that just kind of happened. So when we talk about our history, we also have to know that there are forces, there are reasons that African history has been undermined, and this has been historic. It has been recorded. It's not something that I'm fabricating. We have the knowledge and the information that even during colonialism, even during other forms and even now, like historical civilizations are often attacked. Cultural artifacts are often stolen, removed. So there's a very conscious effort oftentimes to destruct culture, and Frantz Fanon talks about that. Kwame Nkrumah talked about that. In the East, across Africa, the independence leaders knew that this was happening and tried to combat that. So I'm sorry, I'm just kind of getting myself in. I listened to the first 10 minutes, I guess, and I'm just kind of getting in the conversation. So I'll stop there and maybe make contributions later.
No, I'll take that, and I want to come back to something that Nandre mentioned, Jen, about maybe a misunderstanding about youth, and maybe there could be some misunderstanding here, and maybe an oversimplification. But I wonder, Jen, what do you think about this question about youth identity, and how you sort of the factors that you use to understand youth identity, and how these historical factors play a part?
Thank you, Levy. I hope I can be heard now.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to look at the issue of youth identity from two perspectives: as a parent and also as a counselor. When we look at human development, different theorists have defined how people form their identity. And the one that is close to my heart is the work that was done by Erik Erikson about development, especially in the age between 18 and 24, because he talked about people going through a storm. As parents, we don't understand these storms because we have been brought up in a culture that you don't even question parents. It's like do or die. And so it becomes very challenging that this person is trying to identify who he or she is, but then there are so many forces external: the society, the global perspective. When we look at what is expected of this person to identify with, who is he or she expected to identify with. So there are many influences, but if we were to give the psychological perspective a little bit of hearing and help these people to look at themselves critically, then we can see how best we can deliver autonomy. Because the youth have a lot of challenges with autonomy. It's like everyone looks at them as people who have no direction. Yet when we look at the current times, they have brought in a lot of, vibrance, even in the area of COVID-19. We look at what is happening currently, and you'll find that they have come up with developments that were never there or were never given a thought. But now when we don't give them that autonomy, it becomes very difficult, and that is where there will be conflict between parents and youth, because rebellion will be seen. This person is trying to get out of this shell of, I know what I want, I know the direction I want to take, but there are so many people who are dictated, be it in education, be it in the community, and especially in the community. For us Africans, however much we want to say that we are liberal in a way, the community determines so many things. I work in a research organization whereby you find that when a youth wants to participate, or maybe they want to take part, there are other influencers, and that is where the conflicts start coming in, and this person feels like they don't even know. So that is the perspective of the conflict.
I want to touch on something on that notion of psychological perspective. So there's this other concept in psychological, in psychology, which talks about the idea of integration, differentiation, and continuity, in the sense that you start off as a young person and you become integrated in your community and you socialize and you grow up in this community and you form your identity until adolescence. And then from adolescence, you begin to differentiate, which just becomes something naturally happens. And you begin to differentiate and acquire new values and beliefs and perspectives. And so there's this tension I think you're referring to, where you are integrated in your society, you have norms that you're supposed to abide by, you have ascribed identities, if you like, that have been ascribed to you by your community and your society. But then you can differentiate in the sense that in this stage of differentiating yourself is where you're exposed to different forces. And you've seen this with youth using social media to express themselves, using arts to express themselves, because this is a very, like you said, it's a storm, it's difficult, it's a challenging stage of identification. I think this is where this concept of identity crisis actually comes in, this idea of identity crisis, because now you're searching for who you really are. Rebecca, is this a tension you can relate to? The idea that you were once integrated, you have this sense, you don't really leave your community, you're actually part of your community in many ways, it's just who you are. But then you have to sort of differentiate and search for another way to express it. Is this a tension you can relate to?
I can actually, yeah. And as you were saying that, I was just taking some of my own notes. You know, this process of forming an identity, we speak of identity as if it's a static thing, right? So what is African identity? Yes, it's affected by the past and it's something that we're challenged by right now, but identity making is a process. Yeah. And I think once you start to see it like that, it really shifts the conversation, even with what Namre brought up earlier of even, you know, like using the term lost, right? The difference between lost and actively searching, actively creating. So I think that the first thing there is just recognizing the language we use around this. But secondly, you know, interestingly, I want to actually bring this into some concrete examples as well. You know, the identity that you form as you're growing up as a child is one thing. And then you have, in adolescence, you have what I would call the noise that comes in. I mean, especially as young Africans growing up, we do have a lot of Western influence, specifically in a place like South Africa, which I can speak to. And I think you start to see people integrating more of that noise, which can be both a good thing and a bad thing, right? That's up for debate. But I think it's so important to recognize that that early stage of identity making can either alleviate or bring in the attention at a later stage. And I'll give you an example. It's very common in many South African schools to this day, unfortunately, whereby if the school is an English medium school, African languages are banned from the playground, right? So the language that you speak with your grandparents is effectively not allowed in a place of learning, in a place of education. And if that is something that you're exposed to from the age of 6, 7, 8, I mean, you then grow up and maybe you become more conscious about your African identity, and you think back to the time that actually for the majority of your childhood, this very integral part of your identity, the language that you speak with your community, has not been accepted. So I think, you know, you also have to look at these little things that really, really go a long way in shaping you. Maybe you don't see them in your early adolescent years, but they come up as you're older. And to answer your question specifically, for me, definitely, you know, I went to an English-speaking school. Although I grew up biracial, I come from a very traditional family where African culture is something that is still practiced, that is still preserved. And trying to balance these things now with, you know, being a global citizen and not living in the continent, those are things that I do struggle with. And it's an ongoing conversation. As I said, it's a process. It's not a static thing.
Mm-hmm. And Nandre, let me come back to you before I go back to Maurice. So I mean, you probably heard of idea of this notion of essentialism, in the sense that, is there something essential about an African identity that you could say that this is, of course, generalizing is very problematic here, but if someone says there's an African identity, are there some things that are essentially African?
I would say, I was taking notes, and I would say I would not definitely be in the school of essentialism. I actually have maybe a lot of problems with the ideas of essentialism. I'm not going to get into academic debates here, but because of the maybe the audience. But I think that it's very difficult in sometimes. Frantz Fanon talks about an idea called cultural mummification. And in this, he talked about how when culture is disrupted, often by external forces, it tends to wither away. And then it never goes completely, but it mummifies. So it becomes kind of a frozen like object, like an Egyptian mummy. Most people know what that looks like. So it becomes frozen. So I think it's very difficult when we speak about African identity. And first of all, it's very difficult because Africa is such a complex continent. And even in the diaspora, people are claiming African identity. Afrocentricity is very common here in the United States. But looking at cultures that have been severely disrupted in many cases and other influences brought in. So for example, when we talk about oftentimes say, oh, it's not African to, it's an African to not be obedient to your parents. That example was given about obedience to your parents, not speaking. And then also that's obedience in school, not being able to speak your language. So are those actually the ways that African cultures were developed, or are they disruptions of colonialism and neo-colonialism? So for instance, these ways that young people are expressing themselves are often seen as un-African, but then I ask the question, what is African? And then they say, oh, okay, African is being obedient to your parents, strong family structures. So I think there are some common elements, embracing family, communal nature, and many things that cut across African continents, the embracing the collectivity and things like that. But I think oftentimes the term of being African is misused as an identification with sometimes very neo-colonialist appendages. So saying, oh, it's an African, for instance, to have a different sexual identity, when researchers have found that actually different kinds of identity, sexual identities, were actually embraced and were manifest in many different ways in many different African cultures. So I think it's very important. And, you know, I like what Rebecca said about identities being something that's evolving, and even African identity needs to be seen as something that has both been disrupted and is still in the process of evolving. It's not static, and it is going, no matter how we want to take it, it is going to, the new culture that is emerging is going to bring in various elements from all over the world. And the thing is, it always has. There has never been a time that Africa has been an isolated continent. There has always been trade, there has always been global exchanges, and there has always been different religions being brought into the continent. So it's a continual process. So I think there's a big question mark, I would say, and we should continue to question and ask questions about what is African identity. And definitely there's no, for me, in my own research and my understanding, there's no single, there are some elements that are common, but there's no single African identity.
Okay, thank you. So let me ask you some points are coming here, making me think about the idea of arts, the role of arts here also, coming to you, Maurice, because you deal with the arts. So there was a very interesting article I read in MIT Tech Review called A Youth Issue. This was a winning article that was published from a youth who was talking about what it means to grow up in the technology generation. And according to this person who wrote it, who's young, the argument she made is that with technology nowadays, you grow up questioning yourself a lot because there are these multiplicities, as we have talked about, that you have to grapple with. And I think after a while, she got tired of doing it in social media, because she said that after a while it got really tiring. She characterized social media as a container that contains her different identities, and she uses WhatsApp, and she uses Facebook and Twitter and Instagram to sort of package all these identities that she expresses herself in different ways in different mediums. She even talked about another private one in Instagram where she can actually be who she is to a very close-knit circle of people. But after a while, she got tired of it. It became a little bit too tiring for her. And so she decided to do it using art, to express herself using art, poems and arts and other kinds of things. So what do you think, since you deal with arts, how are the ways in which youth in Africa express their different or the multiple identities through art? Maurice.
Okay,
sorry.
so to begin with, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So now when it comes to art, for us, rather, there's something called personal identity. That is how you identify yourself within your own containment, within your own room, within your own self, without anyone around you, yeah? But then you need a mirror, which is like the society, to offer that reflection back to you so that you note who you are in this society or where you exist. So when it comes to art, that's exactly what art is. It's a form of expression that echoes who we are. And art has been morphing over time. And even right now, if you look at, like I think Rebecca said, the way culture is a very personal identity, or identity is a very dynamic thing that keeps on evolving. The same thing is happening in Africa. We cannot be oblivious to what is happening around the world and also fail to understand that it affects us and influences our identity. But as that happens, we tend to start expressing ourselves in different ways when it comes to art. So that's where you'll find the modern artistic ways, African ways of actually expressing different art forms. When it comes from dance, there's modern African contemporary dances, the different forms of arts that are not necessarily traditional African identities as we know, but they have all these elements from them, because also we cannot ignore where we come from and how that has influenced us. So when it comes to expression and art and all these other, because art doesn't necessarily mean music, dance, and all this, even writing and all these other forms of expression. African artists, African writers have been coming up to say the African story, because I think that's where the problem actually began, like Nandri said. When you look back at history, you'll realize there's an African narrative that was either wiped away, that was either washed away, or our generation doesn't know about it. And it was beautiful, to be honest, because I have done several plays and several musicals where we got to understand why Africans did what they did back then. And it was made to look bad, and it was painted that way, and we've always lived knowing that. But once you start understanding what they were trying to do, where the reasoning was from, now you'll understand the artistry behind what they did then. And with that, we'll also be able to express ourselves now, because we live in a place where, like you said, our parents, they come from the generation that was heavily influenced by traditional African culture, but we cannot ignore where we exist. There's a lot of globalization. We are on social media all the time. We're getting information from all over the world. So as Africans, we are torn between, okay, my parents who have taught me this and raised me this way, and the information I'm getting from outside about all these things. But we have to inculcate all of that and express it as who we are. And to some extent, that is always not met, especially with parents, it's not always met with approval, if anything. But that's now our culture. That's how our identity has evolved. And that's why we use art forms to actually express it.
I'm going to come back to Jen in a moment on this point of self-reflection, which is a psychological concept, or the idea of development of self in a moment, because I want you to keep that so that we don't forget it. But to Perpetua, I guess, and Rebecca, because this idea of the world versus Africa keeps coming back over and over, so it's important that we explore this concept. So some studies on identity have shown that people have a fundamental process of their underlying sense of identity, which I think ego identity, if you like, where they experience themselves as being the same person over time in various contexts, which sort of makes it possible for them to exhibit stable behavior patterns, and consistently they endorse this set of values and beliefs to set their goals and maintain commitments. So Perpetua, would you agree with this finding? And if so, what would it take to understand this fundamental process among African youth? Or what are some ways in which you have developed this fundamental sense of self, given that you have been to 6 cities, I guess, and you've been exposed to different social contexts. So how do those 6 different cities around the world, how have they forced you or challenged you to think about that sense of self as an African?
I think first and foremost, it's when you don't agree with what they say about you. And not as in Perpetua as an individual, but sometimes you hear these undertones of what they think about Africans or African youth, and there's just a very huge disparity between who you think you are, who you've been raised to think you are, and what has been said. There's that sense of, and I had numerous conversations, you sort of go into this phase of having a bit of an existential crisis where you go into museums, let's say the British Museum and you see the narrative that they're saying, and you know, because our grandparents, let's say, lived through colonization, and they've told us all these stories, and there's this dichotomy per se that you have to think through, what was I told and what is the story that they're telling on this other side. Mm-hmm. And it shook me to my core, to be honest, because you come into contact with things that challenge who you think you are, how you've been raised, and the stories that are told about you. And when I say you, I'm not talking about Perpetua, I'm talking about who we are as Africans. So for me, the process just involved doing the reading myself, listening. There are a lot of people who are doing podcasts, even on like my own tribe. You start questioning, or you even want to learn how to speak your own language. My mom knows about this because I started like practicing by myself and calling and having all these sorts of conversations, because there's this sense of loss that you feel, that there's such a beauty in our languages, our cultures, that was somewhere lost in between. And so you have to seek that for yourself. And I think you do not even have to leave the country to be exposed to this. So many people, even within, are having these conversations. Morris said that they're directing a lot of plays. I've been to so many of the plays that he's directed, and there's such a sense of, Rebecca said, we are seeking. We really want to know. We're seeking, and we want to tell these stories accurately. And we're going back in time. People are having conversations with their grandparents and their parents, and trying to truly define, what does it mean to be African, and what does it mean to be global. And I think I will pass this on to Rebecca, because I love her tagline.
I want to bring your mom in for a moment.
Okay.
Because you invoked your mom here, and so it's fair enough to give her a chance to talk. So, and I guess, Jenny, you as a psychologist understand this idea of self-concept or reflected appraisals, the messages that we get from others that, affirm who we are or who we tell ourselves are, because our parents, friends, and teachers tell us who we are through reflected appraisals that then become how we tell ourselves who we are. So I guess in some sense you could say, thinking about Perpetua, generalizing this, Jen, is that usually youth will seek this validation from both the social cultural environment they interact with, which is schools, media, churches, parents, and most importantly, their homes, which starts with their parents. What would you say that youth get from their parents, or even African parents, that shape their identity? Or what kind of validation would you say that youth get from African parents that support their identity formation?
Thank you. I first of all want to make a statement that as a parent, most of the times we want to feel in control. So it's like when we give this person autonomy, we feel like we have lost control. So that is what makes us sometimes not allow these people to develop or even to reflect on who they are and what they want. Fortunately, if someone is aware, because self-awareness is the heartbeat of what will help this person grow. If, as a parent, I'm aware of what my child needs, then I will kind of give the ingredients, so to say, that this person needs to grow. And when we look at the self-concept, this is something that really helps people to get in touch with themselves. Because once a person is able to look at what influences me, but deep within me, what do I need? Are we offering as a society, and even as parents, and even as teachers, what we call the core conditions? Because most of the times we are very judgmental. We look at a person and their behavior and not separate the two. Because there's one psychologist known as Psychologist who says that everyone is basically good. But that is something that we really miss out on, because we're looking at the behavior and just looking at the person externally, without seeing that they have the potential to become who they want to be, without necessarily going against the culture of our African culture, which we would want to maintain. Like now, when we look at some of the issues that have come up. We can relate with them behaviorally, we can relate with them psychologically, but at the same time, we can look at what we have done as parents. How did we bring up our children? I want to give an example of Perpetua because she's here. She found me as a counselor, and so she didn't get spanking. Her sister went through a full cycle of spanking because that is the only thing I knew how. And that is why it is very important for us to, to keep learning. Because as much as we are talking about the youth, how do I help Perpetua now to bring her children up in a way that they can gain autonomy? And how do I give her that positive regard that, yes, maybe you have gone against my expectations, but how do we meet? Where do we meet? How do I guide her? Let's go back to school. Most of the times we are focusing on grades, such that we lose the person and their abilities, other abilities. I can assure you that Perpetua wanted to do music in school. And as parents, we thought that she should do German, and she did it well. But unfortunately, she is now struggling to get to music, which was her choice. So it is important for us to look at this youth, or to look at people holistically. Where do they want to go? Sometimes we bring in so much religion. And yet, even us as parents, we are unable to keep up with the standards of this religion that we are trying to infiltrate. I have seen jokes about parents talking about grades, about their children, and unfortunately, then they were not even performing. So most of the times, we want to put this person in a cage. And when we allow them, that is when they will come to bring even development. We are struggling with so many things, like now in COVID. Fortunately, we have youths who have been empowered to do something that can bring a difference. In our country, Kenya, there are youths who have managed to do these beds for the patients that will allow them to get the ventilators and all that. So it is important for me as a parent, as a psychologist, to put that together and see, how do I even get parents to see the youth as people who have the ability to self-reflect, look at themselves, love themselves, see and improve their self-esteem, because sometimes you put them down to an extent that a person loses value of who they are. So if, as a parent or as a psychologist, I have to help this person, I have to offer what we call the four conditions. That am I able to look at this person as an individual and say that, yes, this is the direction you want to take, I can support you. Can I help this person if they are struggling with identity to see that they have the potential? Because what I talked about, losing power as a parent, I feel like I'm powerless when my children start questioning. That should be a thing of the past. However, Nana talked about these negative and positive issues that can arise. And so we need to have some moderation. Where do we meet? Are we able to communicate? Are we able to offer love? Because we can only offer what we got. We got a lot of hostility from our parents. You can tell from my age. And that is exactly what I offer my children. But now when I become aware, I need now to start looking at this person and say, yes, we can meet somewhere, but I want to help you. Look at yourself. Allow you room for self-reflection so that this person appreciates who they are and see their uniqueness. Because most of the times we are doing a lot of comparison. Even as parents, there's what we bring up as, oh, your sister is doing better, your brother is doing better, which doesn't add up because everyone is an individual. And if we're able to look at that, then it becomes better for this person to self-reflect.
So in this case, then we could say this idea of socialization and the self-concept from this perspective of reflected appraisals matter in the sense that you develop this sense of self, or Perpetua develops a sense of self that reflects the way you believe in her and the way you see her, in the sense that you give her these messages about who she is and you affirm them and you validate them. But then you've also pointed out that there could be cases where parents can be too harsh and too strong and undermine some things. And I want to come back to a point, Rebecca, that I read from a text standpoint, in the sense that some youth I was doing some research on what youth use technology for in terms of from identity standpoint. Of course, these are generalizations, and so it's important to think about them, whether you agree with them in a general sense or personal sense. In the sense that some youth use technology to question their identity and to split it into parts. So this was from some other studies, and they also use it to contain those parts of their identities, in the sense that this role that it plays, and to some of them even take it to the point that selfies have that meaning for them, in the sense that selfie is beyond, and I think some of them even say parents don't understand the way they do selfies, because according to some of them, it seems that the way youth use selfies are not well understood by adults, in the sense that some adults see them as narcissistic pictures, but for them, they use it to construct a small part of who they are, and that matters to them. That it's a way of roll calling and say, hey, here, I am here in this way, right? So it's a selfie that sort of does that for them, to their group especially. The argument then, Rebecca, here is that for youth, the selfies are not just pictures, right? But a representation of themselves, the ideas they have about themselves. So what they're saying then is that it can be a way for adults to understand how they express, but of course, they are coded, so they're very difficult to understand. So what do you think? What are your thoughts about this idea of youth using technology to question their identity and split it into parts that are not validated? So Jen just told us about validation, right? So there is some identity that can be validated, and there can be some that are not validated. And for some youth, technology is a way to validate that part. What are your comments about that?
Yeah, this is a very fascinating question. I feel like it's worth giving a disclaimer that, like, up until 3 months ago, I could barely take a selfie because it's always something that has felt so uncomfortable for me. So maybe in that way, I'm not so representative of my generation. But it's really fascinating because I think, on the one hand, yes, there is an incredible empowering factor of the technology that we use. And I definitely agree. I think in terms of validating yourself, and the confidence that I see, amongst people of my own generation, whether it's, so-called content creators or just people sharing information that they care about. I mean, especially we saw this like Black Lives Matter. On the surface level, I would say that's good. I think it's good that we have the ability to shape the conversation, whether it's about ourselves or the issues that we care about. The part where I pause and I think it's important to step back is the difference between how these tools are shaping us as the individual and how they're shaping us as the collective. Because I think that as the individual, these tools empower us. They give us the sense of, oh, I can create my identity. I can contain my multiple identities. I can package it. I can have my profile on this channel and my profile on that channel. I think when you start to look at the collective, however, it's actually less of an active process. It's usually this thing of the mirror. It's usually this thing of, this is what my generation does. This is who we think the African youth are, just to give an example. And I need to now subscribe to that in some way. So it's like, on the individual level, it's you doing the process, but on the collective level, I sometimes feel like it's the platform doing that for you. And it becomes not how we identify in terms of like the imagery that we identify with or associate with, but also the kinds of conversations that we have. I mean, you could go down a rabbit hole talking about just the algorithms that shape our conversations, right? The way that a lot of the way we even use the internet is really biased towards polarization. It's a system that is inherently built in a very specific way. And I think that in terms of identity and making identities, that's actually something that maybe we'll only be able to look at in hindsight, say in 10 years' time, and be like, okay, maybe this is why African youth identify with this specific aspect of themselves. And I think you see this a lot with this Afrocentricity trend. I don't want to be disingenuous about where it's coming from, but a lot of it, let's be honest, is focused around the aesthetics, the parts of our culture that look good on social media, so it's like, I can wear my African garb on Youth Day, but am I fluent in my language? Am I in contact with my family members? These are other questions that I think require us to go a little bit deeper. And I'm not sure if the current platforms that we're using are the ones that are going to get us there.
Nandre, on this point, Rebecca ends with very interesting. What do you think? I mean, I read about this concept of negrescence or negrescence. I think negrescence, the idea that, you can be far away from your identity as an African, and then you can begin to work your way, and Afrocentricity can sort of provide these aesthetics of, you know, as a way of saying you are this person and so forth. What are your thoughts on that point that Rebecca makes?
Well, I think they're very good and very important, valid points, particularly about the aesthetic nature of embracing Afrocentricity. And even here, where I am presently, which is in the US, these debates do go on, like about, can you wear this? Or is some actually people that are very conscious or woke will not actually, I actually had a conversation and they said, I'm not African American, I'm Black. And I said, why? And they said, oh, it's because I actually don't know enough about African culture to claim that. And it struck me a lot because this was actually a student, brilliant young student studying history. And I really thought that she would claim that African American identity, and it was in a conversation like this. And I think that one of the things in my research and what we're looking at is really, we cannot necessarily predetermine. Well, I want to say one thing first, which struck me in several of the discussions beforehand. And that is really, we have to be cautious about using Western epistemologies, Western terminology, Western psychology, philosophy to examine ourselves. Mm-hmm. And even in terms of using these, you know, these different psychological theories about development and all of that, we really have to understand that there is a particular, and in that way, maybe I'm contradicting myself, there are some ways in which we must begin to use our own tools and our own cultures to really examine ourselves. So even the issue of identity, the identity being an individual and not a collective terminology. And I think definitely she spoke to that, Rebecca spoke to that, of saying, okay, you claim an African identity, but you're not connected to your family and to that collective history. So we also have to even understand that even as we use terms like identity, how are we even using the term identity? Are we using African constructs? Are we using our own epistemology? Are we using our own knowledge systems to actually define even the terminologies that we use? And secondly, I think history and historical consciousness are very important. And one of the ways in which we are disconnected, in which historical consciousness is basically saying that history is an anchor. It's a reference point in which we can use to recreate ourselves. So when we don't have that history, when we don't have that knowledge, when we don't have not even just historical knowledge, maybe even geographical knowledge about the African continent, about present cultures, then the formation of identity will be more strongly influenced by what is present. And oftentimes what is most present to young people is their material conditions. And so what is important to them, of course, in this current age, what a young person is defined by their material conditions, and that is their appearances, what they do, what they imagine they should be doing. So I think we cannot necessarily determine how the present African youth culture will evolve, but what we can do is to provide those historical reference points. Let's take, for instance, something very concrete, which is, you know, African women identity. So oftentimes when people are pointing to maybe slightly older than the young people here, saying, okay, yeah, this is what an African woman is. She's obedient, she stays in the house, she takes care of her children. That is not actually historically accurate. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so when youth are fighting and saying, oh, I don't want to be that, I want to be free, actually their ancestors, the female that came before them, before colonialism, were actually free in many ways. They were market women, they created things, they were farmers. And so actually sometimes we're basing our kind of, I find that young people oftentimes are basing that rejection of African values, there is actually a rejection of colonial values and not necessarily African traditions, which are sometimes very different from what we construe as African tradition today. So as I said, so Fanon says that his history and historical consciousness gives us these reference points. So if a young person, for instance, my daughter, talking about like what she wears and how she wears it, she's seeing this as an act of freedom and as a rejection in some ways of what maybe her father or her grandmother wanted her identity to be. And on one hand, she is embracing herself, but on the other hand, she's also being influenced by global media, which says this is what a young Black woman should be, you know, WAP and all this stuff coming out. her identity cannot be constructed outside of that knowledge of herself. At the same time, she can refer to how African women dress traditionally, but without knowing the context of how African women were dressed when they wore less clothing, without knowing the context of the society at that time, it would be misconstructed. So for instance, in the university today, we have African fashion shows, and everyone's coming, you know, with the little pieces of African print, you know, on naked clothing, on very like people would say half naked clothing, but not having the historical context and placing that sort of as being the only thing that is African is also detrimental in a way, because they don't have that reference points, not having that context, which will help in the formation of youth identity.
So Nandre, your question is very interesting, and it brings this idea of perspectives, right? I mean, I want to engage because we mentioned this as as issue of perspectives as well. And I think to some extent, Perpetua, what Nandre is talking about can get us to think about this question of perspectives, or if you like, I like to think of it as worldview, right? In the sense that there are these beliefs that you have about the world. There are beliefs that you have about Africa. There are beliefs you have about the world around you, and they could come from different dimensions. In what way, Perpetua, would you say that the idea of worldview here is connected to how someone associates with the idea of an African identity?
There definitely, as we've talked about, like different angles you can view this from. There's the academic perspective, historical perspective, psychology, and it's based on what you've been exposed to, how you were raised. And this is the importance of bringing people together so that we have a better image, a better picture of what it is that we're looking at. And I think one powerful thing we have right now when it comes to perspectives is we have the power to choose. As young people, we have the power to choose that even if we're embracing our African roots and our African identity, we can't sugarcoat it and say everything was nice. There's, depending on where it's from, even Western culture, like all these different cultures that young people are now pulling from, we have the power to choose both for ourselves what it is you want to pick and what it is you don't want to pick. So that sense of autonomy and choice, that you can view different perspectives. And this even comes with like social media. If you think about the internet in general, let's say you can get a perspective from social media that's perhaps Western. You can log in and get an African perspective based on the people that you follow or the shows that you listen to. You can log in and there's a level of multiple dimensions that we're looking at that kind of complicates things a bit more, but it also just paints a picture of the complexity of this conversation.
I see. Let me tie something to Maurice. Maurice, at the beginning, you pointed out this idea of a youth is confounded with the idea that there is a global context and there are global values and global issues, but you're also an African youth, so in the sense that you have to contend or balance these two different worldviews. What do you think about this idea of you are a youth today, but you're exposed to globalization and other kinds of worldviews? Is this something that you personally, or other youth that you see try to juggle, and how they deal with those different, basically beliefs, right? Beliefs about the world around them, or beliefs about how things should look like? Because a youth could have a different sense of the beliefs they have about how something like unemployment should be addressed, or beliefs of how things to do with education should be dealt with. And so these perspectives could come from different standpoints. So if you were to speak about it from your own standpoint, or maybe from youth that you know, what is the struggle here that an African youth faces? Maurice, can you hear me?
Sorry, I think I missed that the question was directed to me. Sorry for that. Just from what I got, the whole thing about youth, the standpoint and how to identify ourselves.
Can I repeat it for you? Sorry, so that it's clear.
Please do.
So, so I was saying perspectives or worldviews are basically these beliefs that we have about the way the world works, and beliefs about things around us and the way we believe the world should work, right? And these beliefs can come from the way you see yourself or the context or surroundings you're part of. So for example, Rebecca and Perpetua, you've been in different contexts, so you have this, even Rebecca mentioned this, you're exposed to different worldviews about the world, or how people see each other, how people see Africans. Let's take, for example, an extreme example, white supremacy is a worldview about, you know, a certain race, whites being more superior than blacks, and so forth. You have black consciousness, which can also be a worldview. So Maurice, there are these beliefs, Maurice is on and off, there are these beliefs that youth can struggle with. And maybe I'll come to you, Jen, while we don't have Maurice for now. I want to talk about resilience for youth, right? So, because there's this duality that can happen where youth is differentiating. Maurice he's back and forth. Where youth, for example, Perpetua living in the diaspora, where she's exposed to a Western worldview, where that may be very dominant and can be reinforced by certain systems and structures. But then you also have these worldviews that are tied to you as an African. How does resilience play a role here for a diaspora, let's say, who's left and is going to study abroad and they're exposed to different sets of worldviews?
Do you want me to respond to that?
Yeah, resilience, because you deal with this concept of resilience of identity, and I'm just trying to think about why it matters here.
First of all, I want to appreciate the challenges that everyone goes through out of changes that occur, whether it's because of work or education or whatever will cause the change. And most of the times, resilience will come up if somebody has been exposed to some difficult situations, because they will help this person build resilience. However, if somebody has never been given the conditions to develop resilience, like somebody has been cushioned, that everything that happens, if it's like a child who is growing up, if something happens, I'm the one who is rushing to school to fight for my child, it becomes a challenge for this person to adjust. However, Perpetua has talked about choices, because every time we are exposed to risks, we have to make a choice of how to survive. And if somebody has the survival tactics, they can live with it. However, culture shock sometimes takes people, by surprise, that somebody would have expected that the environment they grew up being cushioned, being loved is what is going to happen. So sometimes it can lead to other consequences that people are never prepared for. Because if this person has no fallback plan, like who do I give this information? Who do I share with what I'm going through? This is when now we start encountering issues like substance abuse. And this leads to other consequences, like maybe a person is in a foreign country, they will be deported. And so it becomes a very vicious cycle. You find that maybe students from a certain place or from a certain continent, when they go to study, because they don't have resilience, they don't know how to deal with issues like racism. They don't know how to deal with issues like they have never been exposed to like same-sex love affairs. So you find that this shock, they have no one to share with, because as parents, we have given them an ultimatum: you go study, this is what we expect. Then it becomes very challenging for them. And until they are given maybe some tips, like social skills, because sometimes it's just lack of skills that makes somebody not become resilient, then they can become better. And that is why even social media will help, because like now, with the use of internet, somebody can learn a few skills, just online. Look at what is happening globally, because we are looking at the world and it's becoming smaller every day. Some of the things that we used to hear and feel like they are tales, they are a reality. And when the youth are faced with them, or even anyone generally, they may resort into depression. They may go through a lot of, emotions that they are unable to deal with. And those emotions will lead to something else that may be a challenge to deal with later. But once somebody is resilient, they can deal with that. And resilience will come or will develop with time, because this youth doesn't just learn.
Mm-hmm.
They have been brought up.
Mm-hmm.
And especially it will be different for different genders. Because like for a man, you'll find that culturally we say in our country that men should not cry. But what if this person has gone through such racism that they feel like they don't belong? He might feel that he would want to cry. He might feel that he wants to share, but then it looks like what kind of man is. So I think it is something that needs to be built over time, and especially even as children grow. You'll find that if a boy falls, someone will say, don't cry, you are a man. But this person is feeling pain. So this resilience can only be built with time. But in case somebody doesn't have these things, they can learn. They can look at what is the worst that could have happened apart from what.
Thanks. So you make me think about, there's this article that was written by, I think she's called Nanjala. She's written an article about the contradictory aspect that comes with accepting a Rhodes Scholarship, right? So she has to explain to people, she wrote an article in The Guardian, why did she take, because she faced backlash, like how could you be both anti-colonial but accept a Rhodes Scholarship, right? So there's this contradiction, like we have to deal with all of us in the sense that we seek social progress, but we also have to stay in tune and true to our sense of identity and culture, in the sense that there is this essence of psychological and emotional skirmish that we struggle with, knowing that we are African at the core, but at the same time we struggle because we want to progress in the same way. So there is this tension. And it really ties into what Jen is talking about. And Rebecca, I wonder whether you and Perpetua, and I guess all of us, in terms that we want to seek social progress and we associate with these institutions, and we face that struggle to explain how do we still struggle with that social progress while accepting identity and culture, while accepting certain scholarships and certain institutions that people would say, I can't believe you did it. Those people are so colonial and you're part of their society and so forth. Do you struggle with this somehow, Rebecca?
Oh, sorry about that. Just couldn't find my unmute button. Yeah, it's something I think about a lot, definitely, as someone who spends the majority of their time outside of my home country and is definitely the recipient of the benefits, you know, the privileges even of interacting with certain institutions that maybe in some aspects aren't, I don't know if supporting the cause is the right term to use here, because it isn't so black and white, right? Like, I know a couple of people, you know, who've even been recipients of something like the Rhodes Scholarship. And I think, you know, maybe this is also just my young, naive perspective. Perhaps Jane will have a different opinion on this. But I also think, you know, identity making isn't something that exists in a vacuum, right? You're going to take advantage of the opportunities that are given to you. And I think I fully support people who are conscious of what it is that they want and what it is that they stand for, and have faith in themselves to do so, even within spaces that maybe haven't always been welcoming towards them, even spaces that maybe historically have a very controversial past as to how they got to where they are right now. Because often in the log around, you know, how do you have these conversations with your white counterparts, or how do you face institutions that need to change at a systemic level? There sometimes tends to be this implicit assumption, I think, that this is something you can do on your own. And personally, that's just not something that I buy into. Personally, I think this is something that everyone has to be involved in. So I think just on a principle level, I personally don't have a problem with that. But I think that for sure, we have to remember it can become very tricky, because this doesn't just pertain to something like accepting a scholarship from the Rhodes, from the Rhodes, Mandela Rhodes Institute, or getting the Rhodes Scholarship itself. I think this also pertains to things like bigger things, you know, capitalism, for example. I think that there are many aspects of capitalism that have been explicitly detrimental to African communities and still are to this day. And this is something that we have to address. And I think that the channels with which we're going to address them are probably going to be through our rising entrepreneurs, as well as our political systems. those are things we can change. Those are things we do have control over. And I think reminding ourselves that we have that control is so important. Just the last thing I want to say here is that the backlash that you're saying this person received, I sometimes question whether that backlash comes from a place of thinking that we don't have that control. You have to remember it's a process, it's a constant dialogue that's constantly evolving. And once you make that mindset shift of, I can actually do this and still stay true to my identity as an African and for the things that I believe in, then you are incredibly empowered from that.
Mm-hmm. Nanre, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you a question here from a parental standpoint. Jen mentioned some things also, and you talked about various things, and I can see that Rebecca is also struggling with some things, and all of us are. But Nanre, many parents, and maybe you don't have these struggles, but some parents do. So many parents of African descent in the US, for instance, face these circumstances that make it challenging to raise an African youth or a teenager in the US. Although the youth, because in the sense that although the youth have this internal world at home, they also have to engage with the external world outside their home that gives them these different messages about who they are and how the world feels about their existence. So you find these messages can be contradictory or they can be incongruous depending on where the child is or whoever is associating with. For instance, you've seen, just an example, you've seen students who said, and I think Ibrahim Kendi talks about this in his book, about him going to historically Black colleges because he feels that at least there will be some congruence about who he is and what people say they are. So how do you think this affects identity formation of African youth in the diaspora, Landry?
Well, I think it's very difficult for an African youth, I would say, definitely in a predominantly white society like the US or Europe, to develop their identity outside without acknowledging the structural and institutional racism that exists. And I'll just give some personal examples here. I raised five children in Nigeria, and I'm raising my youngest here in the United States. And she's been a very good child. You say what a good child is, very easygoing and everything. And her first temper tantrum, which I never imagined would be possible because none of my kids do these kinds of tantrums, was in a store where she was trying to choose a doll. And the doll that she wanted was a white doll. And I had already promised I was never going to give her a white doll. There was no question. I didn't even give any of my daughter's dolls. So this one, she wants a doll. It would not be a white doll. And she threw herself. There was a black doll, but the problem, the black doll was actually, it wasn't very pretty, to be honest. It was just not a good depiction of what a beautiful black woman, a black doll should be. It wasn't a very fancy one. It was just TJ Maxx. And so she threw herself on the floor. She wanted this doll. She wanted this white doll. She wanted only this white doll. And so, of course, we left the store. We didn't buy any doll. That was what happened. And it's been a very interesting experience raising her here in a predominantly white neighborhood where she goes to predominantly white school and dealing with the idea that, she does not have to be introduced to race and racism at a young age. That is a lie. It's a fallacy. It doesn't exist. I am an activist, and at a very young age, she's been attending protests with me, and she already has her own concept at the age of 3 about Blackness and Black identity. And as much as I've tried to shield her from that, I think in this current day, it's virtually impossible. So I'm not sure if you wanted me to talk about like how we can cope as, I would say, both as African parents and as young African people. I think there are 3 things that are very essential and important. And that is, the first one is knowing our history and embracing everything that is Black. And why do we have to embrace everything that is Black and African is because of the anti-Blackness that currently exists in our society. And we cannot say it doesn't exist. We cannot deny it. We cannot pretend that it's not part of our reality. So in order to, and it's not about being anti-white, and it's not about hating white people. Embracing our Africanness and our Black identity is an essential element of our survival and our identity development. So if we do not have that, we don't have the strength. And we spoke about resilience. How do we develop resilience? And we often find that we have to have those resources to draw upon. And if we don't have those resources, we don't have that knowledge, we don't have anything to draw on in times of need, in times when we are confronted. We will not be able to say, this is who I am, and this is where I stand, and this is what my ancestors did, and this is my history. So we must embrace our history. Secondly, we must embrace our languages. And, you know, Audre Lorde said we cannot necessarily use the master's tools to break down the master's house. And, you know, I hear what, sorry, I'm trying to make sure I get all the names right. What Rebecca was saying, and what you said also about being in different countries and having these tools. I think it's very important to have these tools, but to understand their limitations, and also to use these, to be in a position of humility, of having these advantages. And one of the ways in which, if we are abroad and we are having the advantage of these universities and these education systems, is to also acknowledge the history of how that came to be and how we have those opportunities, and to never ever think that we are better because we have had those opportunities. So I think humility is very important, and history teaches us that humility. And so as a parent, what I try to do is teach my children, read them books. My daughter, she wouldn't have an afro. She hated her hair. And my son found this book in the store. It actually only emerged during the Black Lives Matter movement, a book. They started selling Black books at Target, which they never did before. And so we bought her this book called Black Hair Love. And when she saw the book and the girl struggling with her hair and her father struggling with her hair, she has not gone off the afro now since then. It's almost 2 months, you know. So it was very important in her own identity as a 3-year-old to embrace her hair and to embrace herself, and to understand that she couldn't have a ponytail. She thought she could have a ponytail, you know. And I'm like, no, you can't have a ponytail. You can only have an afro puff. And I taught her, you know, your hair is afro puff. It's not ponytail, no ponytail in your hair, you know. So these are the ways, you know. And then also I take them home. And I think going home, in as much as you can physically afford it, save your pennies, put your money together, go home as young people as often as you can. When I was in the university here, every single summer, I found a scholarship, I found an opportunity, I went home, I kept learning, and still now as often as you can, go home, take your children home, and continue to, when you're there, not just steep yourself in, you know, go to the mall and go to the movie house. No, you're back home. Go to the village. Go to the stream, go to the cultural heritage sites, embrace those things, and begin to understand and reimagine even your own identity as an African, which is continuously a process of evolving.
Thank you, Nanre. So I wonder, Maurice, because Nanre is talking about this, it makes me wonder, what do you think the role of theater, for instance, can be in this developing this historical consciousness? Or what resources does theater provide that can do this function, can serve this function?
Personally, I feel without art, art is the best way to preserve any culture. Personally, that's what I think. And that's why you'll realize most Africans have a lot of Western influence because of the movies they watch, the series they watch, because they're Western most of the time. And the thing about Africans is we need to start making our own forms of art, which actually get a global scene or anything of that sort. So when it comes to theater in particular, theater, number one, has to stimulate thought. Personally, I will not do anything or put anything on a stage that will not stimulate thought, that will not make you think. And the other thing about art is it tends to tackle issues that people don't want to discuss in public. Just earlier this year, we did a show on FGM, you know, the female circumcision. And that's a very dicey topic to actually tackle and actually speak about. But then the thing about it is we got to understand why different cultures do it and how it is that even countries like Malaysia have it up to now and why it's actually happening. But then when you start understanding that element of it, you'll start realizing that in as much as the practice itself is not really, it has no medical or biological benefits or anything to that extent, there's some girls who actually chose to do it. And there was a reason why they were going to do it. But you see, such understanding, you will not get it from a public conversation, because by the time you bring up something like female circumcision in any forum, you will not be able to have a good discussion around it or even start to looking at the facts behind it. So that's what art provides a platform for guys to actually look at different subjects and highlight different subjects and critically think about them without being judgmental of them. Yes, there's something called an artist bias, which is always there, where we can the creator or the person who's creating the content has a certain bias depending on the exposure or their interactions and all that. But at the end of the day, any sincere artist will actually try to emulate the real-time facts of a particular situation. And that's why it's important for African people to actually make African content, because that's the only way we will preserve this narration. Right now, one of the biggest complaints that we've all agreed upon is the fact that, yeah, our history was disappeared somewhere down the line. Either our grandparents didn't tell us about it, or the narrative changed when we went to school, or we never learned about it. So that tells you we have to step up and actually preserve our history through art and through culture. And that's where theater comes in, that's where writing comes in, that's where movies come in. So whenever you see all these Nollywood stuff and content from South Africa, from Kenya, from different countries coming out, in as much as some of them might not be up to par with you know, the Hollywoods and even perhaps the Bollywoods, it's an attempt of Africans to try and narrate their own stories, which is a good place to start and has to continue.
And that's good. I like the idea that you brought about movies. There's a book called, I think, The White Identity. Basically, it's about the role that media plays in, and I think it resonates with some of what Nanre is talking about, the role that media plays in reinforcing the white identity, right? Because we never talk about it as a culture or identity, but it is a culture, and it can be reinforced and replace what you actually are trying to do from a historical consciousness standpoint. So Perpetua, I mean, we don't have much time left because we wanted to touch this idea of social change. But I wonder, I mean, if we were to sort of talk about this as being important with the context of social change preferences, this idea of identity and worldviews and social change preferences, why is this important with regard to social change preferences from an African youth standpoint?
That's a big question. But I'll just try to draw a little from what everyone has said. There's so much power in understanding yourself and those around you. And also from technology and from social media, we can be able to see different versions of ourselves in other people. Young people are now seeing someone like Greta, who's really mobilizing people for action against like climate change. I remember once going for a performance on Mqamelo Menza, who was a female Kenyan freedom fighter. And so I learned the history and I see a part of myself that it adds something within you that shows you, hi, you can challenge the status quo. You can actually challenge the status quo. And so we're having, you know what Maury said about having a mirror that preserves this narration and also just gives people a glimpse into what they can do and who they can be, to just build that sense of critical consciousness that I can go read articles on what is happening. So I'm giving myself the ability to acquire different perspectives and then sitting down and choosing for myself what it is I want to do. I'm sitting down and I'm thinking through, who am I? And Rebecca said, this is not a one, you can't do it as an individual. So there's that element of having conversations with your parents, having numerous conversations with your friends, thought-provoking conversations. And we are seeing a lot of this nowadays, even with young people, and we're also seeing intergenerational conversations. You know, all these videos where you have, let's say, a parent and a child, and you just go into discussions about the realities of your life, the realities of their expectations for you, the realities of how they were brought up and how you were brought up. And, you know, just Jen said that there's that element of meeting in between or meeting in the middle. And Levy, we talk about this a lot, even in systems thinking, the idea of bringing together different stakeholders. Because for some of these things, you need buy-in. We've talked about just African youth identity. Let's even think in a governance standpoint. How are young people viewed in governance? How, because in one of our first conversations, we had Irene Nyendo, who was Miss Africa, and she said, young people, we often marginalize ourselves out of the conversation because you've internalized that I don't have that much to bring to the table. It's okay, I don't know much. So yeah, I think for me, it's just that power in understanding who you are and building a wide range of angles with which you can view yourself and the world around you. And figuring out what it is about your society or your community that you feel you have a place that you can contribute to meaningfully. And so that brings in that whole idea of social change. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. So thank you all so much for your time. As you can see, it's a big conversation. There are probably questions I didn't even get to and things that I thought we could explore. And I think all of us echoed this point that identity is a very complex issue. It's fragmented, the way people talk about it sometimes. It's an evolving thing, and it's a construct, and it's a concept, and it's also the idea of youth can also be seen as action, and so many ways to look at these things. So we are actually barely scratching the surface, but I think we've introduced enough perspectives and things to think about here, and to build on, at least for those who are watching or listening, and to think about, but not answered any sort of question concretely and say this is what an African identity is. Basically your work to do that, to think about what does it mean, and what does it mean with respect to worldviews, what does it mean with respect to social change and preferences for social change. I think I started by saying that I teach poverty and development in Africa, I teach African experiences, and I teach a lot of students from different parts of the world, and you'll be amazed at the number of perspectives they have about how social change should happen in Africa. And sometimes it's problematic, and most of the time it is problematic because it's dictated from people who don't have those experiences, that history, that understanding. And at least to some extent, we hope that youth can actually begin to speak more about what they think social change should look like, and learn, like Nandre says, about the history and what it means for change. Because sometimes even, for example, take one field like, just an example, like there are some economic studies that are historical, you know, they suggest how development should happen, but with no sense at all of what the history of the continent is, or what it is. Just, you know, you look at it as numbers and you deal with it as numbers. You don't sort of engage in that discussion or the culture and everything. So there are many ways to think about how this links to social change, but because we've run out of time, thank you so much, Jane. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Nandre, and thank you, Maurice. And thank you, Perpetua. And for everyone else who stayed up to the end, thank you so much. This will be recorded and shared if you still want to come back here and reflect on some of the things that were put on the table, because some of these are very critical points for reflecting on and doing your work to dig deeper on this. So with that said, we will end it here so that we can let everyone else go who was who needed to leave exactly at this particular point of time. And back to Perpetua. Perpetua, what's the way forward? Because Perpetua does the logistics. Are we ending this here? Are we taking questions, or what's it? Because we have to let people go.
Yeah, I think we'll end this here because it was meant to be an hour and a half. Feel free to engage us on our social media handles. I'll also I've dropped our email in chat. So if you want to have a conversation with us about this, collaborate, as we've seen, this is one thing where we need all heads, you know, put together. So yeah, we look forward to that. Yeah.
All right, thank you all. And panelists, we'll see you in for a short debrief, just a short one. But for everyone else, until the next conversation, thank you so much for staying with us, and send us an email.